Bonjour et bienvenue dans À contre-courant.
Hello, and welcome to A Contre-Courant. Here we share viewpoints and perspectives that the propaganda media choose to ignore. That deafening silence from the propaganda outlets hides the background of the war, the living conditions of people in the conflict zone, and the interests and position of the Russian side. Someone who approaches things differently, who truly knows what war means, who understands how people there live, and who knows the context of this conflict. Someone with whom I personally experienced a drone alert, and who has often come under fire, is the French war correspondent Christelle Néant. She's been living in Donetsk since 2016, and that's where I had the chance to speak with her.
Donetsk depuis l'année 2016. C'est là-bas que j'ai pu m'entretenir avec elle.
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person.
Christelle, you've been a war reporter here in Donetsk since 2014. Why?
À Donetsk de 214. Pourquoi?
Alors, je suis arrivée dans le Donbass en 2016, donc 2 ans.
I arrived in the Donbass in 2016, 2 years after the war began. I made that decision because, first of all, I saw how the French media were covering the conflict, completely biased, completely one-sided, sometimes even completely reversed. They were putting the blame on people who were actually the victims, including those being shelled by the Ukrainian army. And I just couldn't stand it. I really couldn't. I already had some contacts here, people who were reporters, including a French journalist named Laurent Braillard.
Entre autres un reporter français, Laurent Braillard, mais il ne pouvait rester, il avait commencé en 2015.
But he had started in 2015, and he could only stay for a year. After that, he had to go back to Moscow. So I knew that once he left, there wouldn't be any French journalists living full-time in the Donbass to tell what was really happening there. You have to remember that at the time, there were daily bombings. Even though the Minsk agreements were in place, it was important to be there all the time to report on people's everyday lives. At the same time, I had started working with the agency that had just been created here, the DONI International Agency. I was helping them with bilingual translations into French, and I had a lot of people on social media telling me, "What you're spreading is Russian propaganda."
Mais ce que tu propages, c'est de la propagande russe. Tu ne sais pas ce qui se passe réellement là-bas.
You don't really know what's happening over there. And after a while, a friend of mine went to fight in the Donbass, a French guy as a volunteer. That's when I thought, why shouldn't I go too? Not to fight, but to tell the truth about what's going on. I thought about it for a month. And after that month, I made my decision. I talked to the head of the agency and said, I'd like to come work with you. And he said, welcome to the team. So then it was late 2015, November, when I made the decision. It took me some time to get the paperwork ready, to save up some money because I knew the agency didn't have a budget. And then I left. I arrived here at the end of March 2016.
And did you see that happening while it was going on?
A lot. I've seen a lot of war crimes committed by the Ukrainian army, many bombings of purely civilian areas, and deliberate shelling. Because with the accuracy of artillery today, you can't hit civilian zones that are 2 or 3 kilometers from the front line or even farther and then claim it was a mistake. I've seen a great many bombings of civilians and many civilian victims of those attacks by the Ukrainian army. I also saw how biased some international organizations were, like the OSCE. I witnessed it myself. I'll always remember December 2016, when the Ukrainian army shelled the Kuybyshev district with heavy artillery. We went there with some colleagues. We saw the OSCE working on site. They even took photos. There was this elderly woman. Her garden had a huge crater more than 8 feet wide and over 3 feet deep. The next day, we realized it had to be heavy artillery, at least 122 millimeters, maybe even 152. But in their report the next day, the OSCE wrote that it was an 82 millimeter mortar. An 82 millimeter mortar makes a hole like that? No way. That really disgusted me. And that's when I told myself, what I'm doing matters. Reporting what's actually happening, filming the aftermath of those bombings, explaining what's really going on, what calibers are being used, and talking to the people affected.
Et d'interroger les gens. Et c'est vrai que par exemple, j'ai toujours interrogé les civils.
And it's true that, for example, I've always asked civilians, who's bombing your homes? Because in Western media, they were saying it was the rebels, or even the Russian army. That's what they were saying. Yes, I remember in June 2022, my car was literally destroyed in a bombing here in Donetsk, in the Petrovsky district. The Ukrainian army shelled that civilian area. We were near a mine, the Chelyuskintsev mine, and it was completely destroyed by the strike. It caught fire. There were miners underground at the time. Fortunately, they managed to make it back to the surface on their own.
Par eux-mêmes, mais ils ont bombardé toute la zone pendant 5 heures.
But they bombed the whole area for 5 hours, that mine. Then the small store where we'd taken shelter. We later realized they had a drone that saw us hiding inside. And they bombed that store with cluster rockets, with everything they had. My car was turned into a sieve. Sadly, several civilians were killed, and others were injured in that strike. And there was nothing military there. It was just a coal mine and a small store. What was the target supposed to be? It made no sense. In downtown Donetsk, too, in 2022, they shelled the city center with 155mm artillery. They killed several little girls. One of them died on Chelyuskintsev Street. She was just playing outside. She was literally torn in half by shell fragments. Another one was killed not far from here, a bit further down Artyoma Street. She was going to be a ballerina. She was supposed to leave for St. Petersburg to study at a professional ballet school. But she never got the chance. She was coming back from ballet school with her grandmother when she was struck by a 155mm shell, most likely French.
Très probablement français. Et moi, quand je vois ça et que je vois que l'Occident.
And when I see that, when I see the West supporting, funding, and arming Ukraine, giving it the means to keep this massacre going, it makes me sick. It really makes me sick to see that. It shouldn't be like this. The West, supposedly the defender of democracy and human rights, but where are they? Where did they go? Western countries are backing a nation that's been committing war crimes for 10 years, and they're even supplying the weapons to do it. I've seen it myself. On New Year's Day, they bombed downtown Donetsk with a multiple rocket launcher called Vampire, Czech-made launchers firing Slovak rockets provided by Slovakia.
Avec des roquettes slovaques fournies par la Slovaquie. Ils ont bombardé le centre-ville de Donetsk.
They bombed downtown Donetsk on New Year's Eve. Luckily, for safety reasons, the authorities had banned large gatherings. They hit Lenin Square, where there's usually that huge Christmas tree people gather around every year. It's a good thing the authorities decided to forbid public gatherings, otherwise it would have been a massacre. I've seen so many war crimes, I've filmed so many of them. That's probably why I'm listed on the Mirotvorets website, the sort of Ukrainian Gestapo 2.0, because I've been exposing these war crimes for 8 years now. I document them, I film them, and I publish everything so that people in the West can understand what's really happening. Because the media don't tell them. Or they say it was the Russian army that bombed. I've seen that myself. On the French channel France 2. When the Ukrainian army shelled the central market in Donetsk, that was at the end of 2022, a young man was killed, and there was a bus passing by. The shell landed right next to the bus, and a 14-year-old boy died inside. The France 2 reporter did his job properly. In his stand-up, he clearly said it was the Ukrainian army. But later, when they edited the report in Paris, they said it was the Russian army that had bombed the central market in Donetsk. And that journalist showed a lot of courage. On Twitter, he told them, "No, you're going to correct that. There's a mistake. It wasn't the Russian army that bombed the market. It was the Ukrainian army. Please correct both the tweet and the video." I thought to myself, man, you're going to lose your job. He's still got it for now, But I was really impressed by his courage, because he was one of the few who dared to speak up. Because that's pure manipulation, when you can see it was the Ukrainian army and then they go on to say it was the Russian army that bombed the place. What kind of horror is that? That's not journalism anymore. That's propaganda.
C'est plus du journalisme, c'est de la propagande.
Were you in Bakhmut, in Kramatorsk?
Non, je n'ai pas pu m'y rendre parce que c'était très
No, I couldn't go there because it was extremely dangerous, and especially because, among other things, a Russian journalist was seriously injured not long after the area was liberated. So, yes, after that they became very, very protective, especially toward women journalists. They're really afraid for me. For now, they won't let me go there. But I was able to interview people who were evacuated, civilians who were taken out of Artyomovsk. They told me about war crimes committed by the Ukrainian army. They described how there's an organization called the White Angels that was tracking down children to evacuate them by force, with or without their parents. In other words, they were ready to take the children away. We've discovered that there's actually an entire child trafficking network in Ukraine.
On a découvert qu'il y a tout un trafic d'enfants en Ukraine, en fait. Ils sont enlevés par ces organisations.
They're taken by these organizations and then sent off to Western countries. Nobody knows exactly where. They're declared orphans even though they actually have parents. In fact, what the West and Ukraine accuse Russia of at the International Criminal Court, supposedly deporting children, is exactly what Ukraine is doing. That's what Ukraine is doing. It's involved in child trafficking for pedophile networks and organ trafficking, and some of those children have been found. One of them is a young girl who was taken from her school in Chasti when it all started in 2022. The children were forbidden to call their parents. They were taken all the way to Lviv on the other side of the country. But fortunately, she managed to find a phone and call her mother.
Mais heureusement, elle a réussi à trouver un téléphone et à appeler sa mère. Et elle a prévenu, on est à côté de Lutsk.
And she said, "We're near Lutsk. Please, Mom, come get me. Please come get me." So her mother went there and she made a huge scene. At first, they didn't want to give her daughter back. But she caused such a commotion that they finally did. And here's the crazy part. When they handed the little girl over, the school principal, the one who had taken about 10 children from the school without telling their parents, said, "Oh, wait, I need to give you your daughter's original documents." That meant her birth certificate. And the mother said, "How could you have it? I have it with me." Then the principal handed her a birth certificate that said the little girl was an orphan. They had actually made a fake birth certificate to make it look like the child was an orphan. And the plan was to send all those children afterward to Poland. After that, no one knows where. And there are lots of stories like that. They also told us in Artyomovsk, the people who had been evacuated told us that if the Ukrainians saw, because they had set up a small stove in the basement where they were hiding since their apartment had been destroyed by the bombings, if they saw smoke coming out, they would bomb the basement. People had to stay in the cold down there, in just no cooking, no heat. And in the end, when they pulled back, when the Ukrainian army retreated, they mined the whole building and blew it up, knowing there were about 15 people in the basement. 7 of them died, including a child.
Il y en a 7 qui sont morts, y compris un enfant.
Est-ce que vous pouvez expliquer pourquoi
Can you explain why Putin attacked Ukraine in February 2022?
attaquer l'Ukraine à février
2022. Alors,
oui.
en fait, tout a commencé.
Actually, it all started on February 16th. Up until then, it's true, the number of bombings had been very low. We can't really say the Minsk agreements were being respected, but there was still more or less a ceasefire. There were a few sporadic shellings, but nothing major. Then, on February 16th, 2022, we woke up to the sound of artillery. Here, in the LPR, the Ukrainian army went from firing just a few shells a day to about 500 a day per republic. That means 500 in the DPR and 500 in the LPR, and then it went up to 1,000 a day per republic. So we suddenly saw a sharp rise in bombings. Strikes on downtown Donetsk, on Luhansk, cities that hadn't seen that kind of heavy shelling in years. Right away, the authorities in both republics launched a massive mobilization. At the time, we had about 26,000 soldiers in the DPR, around 14,000 in the other republic, so roughly 40,000 in total. But we understood that across from us, there were already hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops. We'd been warning for months, actually, that the Ukrainian army was gathering men and military equipment near the front line. We had sounded the alarm, tried to make the international press understand that Ukraine was getting ready to attack us. And on February 16th, that's when it started. They bombed and bombed and bombed for several days. On February 18th, the DPR and the LPR announced the evacuation of women, children, and the elderly to move them to safety in other regions. Mobilization took place. And it was against that backdrop that on February 21st, Vladimir Putin, Russia, first recognized the existence of the two republics, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, and signed a military cooperation agreement. The goal was to make Ukraine understand, look, you're about to cross a red line. No, it's absolutely out of the question for you to attack the two republics or throw the Minsk agreements in the trash. If you do that, we'll step in. That was the whole point of that military cooperation agreement. It was meant to make Kiev understand, no, stop, you're about to cross a red line, and if you do, we'll intervene. I don't know, maybe they thought it was just a bluff. So they went ahead anyway. They started trying to attack, among other places, in the north, toward the Luhansk People's Republic. They tried to break through the front line. And then, on the morning of February 24th, Vladimir Putin made his announcement because he couldn't just stand by. He knew we didn't have enough soldiers to resist an army. I believe the Ukrainian army had gathered more than 500,000 men. Even if we mobilized every man from both republics, it still wouldn't have been enough. So we needed help from the Russian army. The Russian army stepped in to prevent a massacre, to prevent a genocide, plain and simple, because they knew very well what Kiev was going to do. Several Ukrainian politicians never even tried to hide it. They said, we'll take it back by blood. Then we'll put people into filtration camps.
On va mettre après les gens dans des camps de filtration, donc comprenez des camps de concentration, voilà, et qu'en gros tous ceux qui sont pas assez pro-ukrainiens,
basically anyone who wasn't pro-Ukrainian enough, pro-Kiev, or pro-Stepan Bandera would be eliminated or deported. There was a real intent to get rid of the pro-Russian population in the Donbass, but that's the overwhelming majority of the people there. We saw the same kind of rhetoric about Crimea, with talk of ethnic cleansing. Vladimir Putin was faced with a choice, either stand by and watch the Donbass literally be wiped out right on Russia's doorstep, something the Russian people would never have forgiven, or step in, knowing that Russia would be blamed, sanctioned, and so on. But Russia had been preparing for that kind of scenario since 2014. And that's what allowed him to hold on. And that's why Russia stepped in to save the people here. Because Ukraine was bombing, we had so many civilian casualties at the start of 2022. They were shelling the city center. If you went to the supermarket here, you see behind me, right here, it was bombed. It was bombed. And that was the hotel where the OSCE used to stay. That's the hotel where the OSCE lived. And they bombed that area. They bombed the entire Pushkin Park, where there are lots of people with children. It was a real bloodbath. Since 2022, I think around 150 children have been killed just in the Donetsk People's Republic under Ukrainian army shelling. It's a massacre.
The French historian Emmanuel Todd wrote, "This is the defeat of the West." Is that true?
Yes, that's right. It's a moral and societal defeat, really. I'm honestly sickened by what the West is doing, supporting a regime whose heroes were Nazi collaborators. Let's be clear about that. Stepan Bandera, the hero of Ukraine, whose slogan has been adopted as the slogan of today's Ukrainian army, because glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. What is that? It was the slogan of the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which took part in the Holocaust, massacred hundreds of thousands of Poles in Volhynia and Galicia, killed Russians, and committed war crimes so vile that even the SS were disgusted. And the guy who was running that organization, the one who praised Hitler, well, that guy is considered a hero in today's Ukraine. And in the West, let me be honest with you, we're really seeing a kind of rehabilitation happening. I was shocked, for example, to hear Ms. Baerbock say that basically Ukraine had brought back the swastika as a symbol. What? Seriously? I mean, at what point did something completely snap in her head? No, Ukraine has not brought back the swastika. No.
Non, l'Ukraine n'a pas réhabilité la svastika, non. Bien au contraire. Il utilise vraiment dans cette symbolique.
Quite the opposite. They're really using it as a symbol to promote and support a neo-Nazi ideology in Ukraine, and that's unacceptable. The West is making a huge mistake by funding and arming a regime built on a neo-Nazi ideology. And it doesn't matter whether its president is Jewish or not. That makes absolutely no difference. Because now, the target isn't really the Jews anymore. The target is the Russians. The Russian speakers, the pro-Russians. And that's what's happening.
Les pro-russes. Et c'est ça qui se passe. Et pour moi, ce qui se passe actuellement, c'est une décadence totale.
For me, what's happening right now is the total decline of the West. And in a way, I've come to want that collapse to happen so it can no longer carry on this work of death. Because that's what it is, the West spreading chaos all over the world, as it's been doing for decades now, spreading death and destruction everywhere. They brought instability to Syria, to Libya, and we've seen the terrible consequences of that, among them the massive wave of illegal immigration to Europe once Libya was turned into a real wasteland.
Une fois que la Libye a été transformée en véritable champ de ruines, maintenant, ils font ça avec l'Ukraine, et moi, ça me révolte.
Now they're doing the same thing with Ukraine, and it makes me furious. According to confirmed figures, just based on compilations of obituaries, 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers have already died. 500,000! I mean, how long are we going to wait before saying it's time to sign peace agreements? There were peace talks in Istanbul, Boris Johnson came in, canceled everything, and the result is 500,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers. That means 500,000 sons, fathers, and husbands who will never come back. And right now, we're nowhere near serious negotiations, which means that number is only going to keep growing.
Ce qui veut dire que ce chiffre va continuer à grossir. Et moi, ça me dégoûte.
And honestly, it disgusts me. Because contrary to what a lot of people say, I have nothing against Ukraine or the Ukrainian people. My problem is with the current government, what it's doing, its actions, its decisions. It makes me sick to see women burying their husbands, while military recruiters show up at the funeral to take away other men who a few months later will end up in the grave right next to them in the same cemetery. Because that's what's happening right now in Ukraine. And to me, the fact that the West has taken Kiev's side and is willing to cover up war crimes, neo-Nazi ideology, and so on.
You mean the war against Ukraine and Europe's own suicide?
C'est un suicide et de l'Ukraine et de l'Europe complet.
It's a suicide for Ukraine and for all of Europe. The West in general is playing with nuclear fire. We have to remember that Russia has the largest number of active nuclear warheads ready to be used, and that it also has hypersonic delivery systems that Western air defenses can't stop. And on top of that, with the sanctions that have been imposed, Europe is basically committing economic suicide.
Mais l'Europe est en train de se suicider économiquement. On le voit en Allemagne. Quand j'ai vu que
You can see it happening in Germany. When I heard that Volkswagen was now considering shutting down factories there, I thought, that can't be real. How could such a historic German manufacturer leave its own country? That shows how serious the situation is. And in France, it's the same story. We're seeing record numbers of business and factory bankruptcies. I still have family there, and they've told me about it. Some of my relatives are entrepreneurs. They run small businesses. And there were times when they had absolutely no contracts at all.
What would you say about the mental state of our elite in the West?
L'élite occidentale.
When I look at the Western elite, they seem like psychopaths. These are people who, first of all, have no empathy. You get the feeling they've lost all sense of humanity. They talk about how we have to support Ukraine, we have to do this, we have to do that, but they don't care. They don't care that this support, this money, ends up killing innocent civilians on both sides. Because unfortunately, even though I know Russian forces are making every effort to make their strikes as precise as possible, aimed only at military targets. Unfortunately, since Ukrainian forces are using civilians as human shields, and I've seen proof of that in Mariupol, people have testified to it. I've heard dozens of accounts from people who said the Ukrainian army used them as human shields. So there are civilian casualties on the Ukrainian side, and there are casualties on the Russian side as well. Among civilians, among soldiers, it's everywhere. As I said, about 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed, plus all the wounded, all those who've been amputated, who've lost an arm, a leg, or even both.
That's exactly right.
C'est exactement ça. J'ai vraiment l'impression qu'on a des fous.
I honestly feel like we've got madmen in charge, madmen running the governments of the Western world, people who have no idea what they're doing. I mean, you don't play games with a nuclear power like Russia. This isn't a country with 3 or 4 warheads, it's a country with tens of thousands. One wrong move from NATO, and we're looking at a scenario of mutual nuclear annihilation. I really want people to understand what that means. It means we'd literally destroy the planet and wipe out any form of normal human society. And for what? So a few people can line their pockets, because that's what it really comes down to. Actually, it was said very clearly by, I think it was Lindsey Graham, the American politician, who said, yes, we support Ukraine, but it's a profitable investment, because in Ukraine's subsoil, there are tens of trillions of dollars worth of mineral resources that interest us. I mean, they say it openly. So we're risking the annihilation of humanity for a few tens of trillions of dollars? Basically, a few tens of trillions of little pieces of paper with numbers printed on them. We're really going to risk wiping out humanity for that? Are we being serious here? At some point, you realize that Western politicians are completely out of touch. They're disconnected from reality. They're psychopaths, really. They have no awareness of anything. They feel only one emotion, and beyond that, they just don't care. 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers dead, tens of thousands of civilians killed on both sides, indescribable destruction, unspeakable horrors. Civilians who've lived through war crimes are traumatized for life. And all of this for what? So a few people can make money?
What are you expecting for the future?
I really hope we'll soon reach a point where Ukraine comes to the negotiating table. Western countries have a huge responsibility in that regard. All they have to do is stop funding and arming Ukraine, and Kyiv will sit down to negotiate. I truly hope that happens soon, because the longer this conflict drags on, the more victims there are on both sides. And that's unacceptable. This conflict should never have broken out. Ukrainians and Russians are one and the same people, divided only by the twists of history. But they are one and the same people. They're connected through marriages, shared families, and so on. It's a fratricidal conflict. It should never have happened. So I really hope we can reach a solution through diplomacy, because otherwise it's going to end in a real bloodbath for Ukraine. It'll end in a demographic disaster for the country. That's already happening right now. At the moment, there are 3 deaths for every birth. If things keep going this way, the Ukrainian nation will simply cease to exist. In a few decades, there just won't be anyone left in Ukraine. Is that really what they want?
That was Christelle Néant, the French war correspondent based in Donetsk, who knows what war really means. Here at Gegendenstrom, we share viewpoints and perspectives that the propaganda media choose to ignore. Stay with us.
Restez avec nous.